The extrude command allows you to create a surface by sweeping a profile curve either through open space in a given direction or along an existing profile curve. You at least need one profile curve in order to create an extrusion. In most cases, you'll need a profile curve as well as a path. Let's have a look. I'll start off by creating a profile curve just for the basics of the tool. So any curve will do. Say something like so. Now let's go to Surfaces, Extrude, open up the options, and for now I'll reset everything. The first area of options you have is the style of the extrusion. You have distance, flat, and tube. Flat and tube I'll talk about separately. We'll start off just by looking at distance. What this is going to do is just use a profile curve and move it a given amount in a given distance, in a given direction. So we can start off by controlling the extrude length. That's how far, of course, we're going to be moving this. We can control the direction that we're going. We can start off in the profile normal, where if I click apply, notice how we just move 1 unit in the normal direction of our profile. So because my curve was planar, in this case it simply shoots out forward in the X direction. I guess you could say backward. But we can increase that if we want so that we end up with a longer extrusion. Or we can specify the direction if we want. We can choose to go on the X-axis. Y or Z won't really help us. Let me take this curve for just a moment, and I could rotate it, say, around the 45-degree mark here in Y. And then if I select this curve, and now if I were to select, say, the X-axis, you'll see we're going off in this direction, and then I could maybe go off in the Z-axis like so. So there's a couple of different extrusions there. You can also specify your own vector if you switch over to free, and you can punch in the digits for a particular vector in which you'd like to move. This is, again, something that I typically don't ever do. So, if you're really awesome with vectors and you want to punch in a direction you know, have at. You can control the surface degree, whether it's going to be linear or cubic. This is really only in the direction of the extrusion, so by default it's probably not going to matter too much, though I usually leave things on cubic just as a standard. Now let me increase my extrude length to something like, let's say something really far, like 20. So we get something like this. You can also control the rotation and the scale of this. So let's say I rotate this 180 degrees and click apply. Notice how we're rotating, like so. Kind of a cool little response. And we can also control the scale. So as I bring the scale less than 1, in this case, and click apply, notice how we kind of squash down as we go down. And as I take it greater than 1, we increase as we move along. Now, you can control all of these after the fact. You'll notice that as I've been doing this, I get an extrude node, and this is going to have access to pretty much everything that I've been using so far, so I can control that direction. Right now, of course, it's in Z. If I wanted to, I could switch that off and set this to 1 in X, so now we're moving in the X direction. I can control the length of the extrusion, which the virtual slider is going to cap out at 10, but you can pump any number you want in here. So let's say 5, or maybe, I don't know, let's say 100, like so. So we get a nice big, long wrapping extrusion. We can control the rotation, and we can adjust that scale as well. So that's a look at the standard extrusion just using distance. Now, before I leave that, let me actually undo back a little bit. You can choose whether or not you're going to use the complete curve or just the partial curve. Just as a quick example, let me go ahead and do an extrusion like that. And we'll switch off rotation. And you'll notice that I have a sub-curve node, so I can select that, press the T key, and I can control how much of the curve we've actually used to create our extrusion. So, very handy there. Now we'll go ahead and nuke all of this out, and we will create a new extrusion using a profile curve. In this case, just a circle. Oh, excuse me. Let's frame up on it for a moment. As just an example to help illustrate a point later on, I'm going to move the pivot point of this circle to just kind of some arbitrary location outside the circle itself. Now let's create a path curve, which I'll create in the side view. I'll grab my CV curve tool, and just something like so. So we have a profile, and we have a path. I'll select the profile, select the path. Let's open up our options for our extrude tool again, and we'll blow these back up a little bit so we can see all of our options again. Now let's set our style over to flat. What flat is going to do is move your profile along your curve, but it's not going to rotate the profile. The profile will keep the exact same orientation the whole time it's created. Now, I'm going to go ahead and kill off my rotation, and we'll kill off our scale. I'll look at that here in just a moment. We'll leave that at 1. You can control the result position, whether it's going to be at the location of the profile curve, in this case the circle, or the location of the path, the curve that we drew over here. This is the only option that you can't really adjust after the fact in your node. So get this one right when you do it. We'll go ahead and leave it at profile, meaning that our extrusion will pop out of the profile like so, and click apply. Now take a look at what has happened. We have indeed followed the shape of our path curve, but notice that the profile curve never rotated as it went along in that direction. In fact, if I were to view this in the side view, it actually completely flattens out as we get up to the crests and troughs of the curve like so. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some of these other options. If I switch off flat, let me go ahead and delete this. We don't really need this anymore. We can go over to tube. And well, hang on. Before I leave that, let me just kind of demonstrate real quick. You still do have access to rotation if you need to do any rotation to the object as it goes around, so you can get some cool effects there. And then, of course, you can adjust the scale. Now let's delete that, because in the case of this particular curve, that's not going to help us too much. Let's switch over to tube. And what tube is going to do is rotate the profile curve about its pivot as we go down our path. Now again, we can control our result position. This time, just as an example, I'll set this to at path. As soon as you activate tube, you can control the pivot of rotation. Remember, the whole idea of tube is that you're rotating the profile as you sweep along the path. You can have the pivot be at the closest endpoint. And what that means is you'll use the closest endpoint to the center of the profile's bounding box. And that's a lot of words that basically say whichever side of the curve happens to be closest to your profile, that's the point you're going to use as a pivot point. It's not actually going to control where the surface ends up. That's controlled up here in result position. It's just going to control that pivot of rotation. You can also choose component pivot, which will actually use the pivot point of the profile curve itself. And there's a third option that you don't even see. Let's just start off with closest endpoint for now. And we'll click apply, like so. So you see that we have something that looks a little bit on the scary side. But if we come in here to the side view, you'll notice that as I adjust the profile curve, as I adjust the path curve, I can move it such that it's kind of a balance of the offset of our profile, which remember the pivot for that is over here. Once I get the path curve such that the pivot of our profile is 50% in between the two, you start to get kind of a predictable response. And as I slide back and forth, you can see how that pivot offset is affecting what's going on here. So it'll look unpredictable at first, especially if you've got a real major difference in the locations of your profile versus your path. But as you kind of slide things around, you'll start to get something a little more predictable. To be completely honest, I don't think I have ever effectively in a modeling project ever used the closest endpoint as my pivot. Now, component pivot, on the other hand, we can use, and I'll go ahead and switch our result position over to the profile so it's back over here. Click apply. Now look at this. It's actually using the pivot point of our object as its rotation, which is cool, but remember how I offset that pivot? It's still giving us some unpredictable results. So our third option that, again, we don't even see, it doesn't actually pop up in the window, interestingly enough, is if you come in here under your node, you have use component pivot. There's a new one, center of the bounding box of the profile, which would mean the center of our circle in this case. So I can click that, and now we start to get something that's quite a bit more predictable. So very, very cool there. Now, if we open our options up again, we can control the orientation of the final surface, if it's oriented to the path's direction, which in this case it is, or if it's oriented to the profile's normal. Now, here it's just a checkbox called Use Profile Normal On or Off. If this is off, you're using the path direction. If it's on, you're using the profile normal. Now, watch how our surface changes when I switch this on. We're still moving in the same direction, but we start our surface off by moving in the direction of the profile's normal, which is a lot handier because it gives us much more predictable results in this case. We get a nice tube shape that goes from one end to the other. So from here, we can also control rotation and scale, so we can adjust our scale if we want. Now that's scaling it up at the end, so that's a little bit interesting looking. And then, of course, we can adjust rotation. Let me create a new example that's probably a little closer to what you would do in a practical environment. So let's say I have a surface. Here, let's just create some surfaces sort of as an example. We'll say here's an engine, and here's some sort of component to the engine, like a battery or something. I don't know. Use your imagination. Could be a lot of different things. And we'll offset these two from one another. And what we want to do is we want to create a hose that connects from the top over here over to this object. So I'll start off by creating a CV curve, which we'll just click a nice hose that does a little bit of waving. Let me kind of wave it just a little bit more. And then we'll straighten it out right as it comes over here to the second component. I'll go ahead and pull this CV down a little bit so it actually plugs into the box. Then, of course, we need to go into a top view and make a few adjustments to this as well. So I'll just kind of adjust my CVs. So I have this nice curve that goes from one box right into the other. So now I can create my profile, and since I'm making a hose, a circle will work out. You can create any shape you want to run along this profile. It's entirely up to you. I'll select my profile, my path. We'll go to Surfaces, Extrude. And what I'm going to choose is Tube, Result Position. In this case, at the path. We want it to be right here. We'll go ahead and leave this set to component for now, and we may choose to change it to center of the bounding box of the curve, though we probably won't have to. And orientation, we'll go ahead and leave at path direction or profile normal. In this case, it's not going to matter because they're both moving in the same direction. And we'll click Apply, and boom, we get a tube that's plugging from one right over to the other. Any changes you may need to make, you can make over here inside your node. So if we set this over to center of the bounding box of the profile, we get a little bit of a change. In this case, we don't really want to do that because it moves our object over. So let's just set this back over to component pivot, and that's going to work out. If our tube looks like it's a little bit too wide by the time it makes it over here to the second object, of course, we can adjust our scale a little bit. This may require, in effect, that we take our curve and make some adjustments like so. So don't be afraid to do that. You get some nice history controls there. And then, of course, if you wanted to, you could make some twists, add some rotation to it. So we won't really be handling that in this case. We don't need to. Also, something else to be aware of, you don't necessarily have to just use one profile curve. I could create a duplicate, and let's just make a couple of copies of this like so. Whoops. And I can grab all of these profiles at once, grab my path curve, and extrude, and I get them all extruded at once. Now, in this case, because I told Maya that I wanted my result to be at the path, they all kind of stack on top of one another. So just for this example, let me do this. I'll go ahead and grab my extrude. We'll set the result position at each individual profile and click Apply. And notice how each one of them is over here. This is a great way if you need to create the effect of like many hoses all plugging into the same thing, or perhaps like you're doing exhaust headers or things like that. You could make multiple profiles, make one curve that controls them all, and extrude them all at the same time. Then, of course, like here, you have these the extrusion kind of billowing over itself because this is so wide. You can adjust your profile after the fact to make some nice changes to this with construction history. So that's about it. That's really all there is to the extrusion command. Very, very handy command for creating a variety of different surfaces, and that will wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot.